everyone, and welcome to my channel. Today I was reading this very great article about NFP, and I wanted to share it with you because it's just such a great presentation of magisterial references to NFP and a very reasonable presentation on it. I'm actually getting ready to do another video analyzing some anti-NFP materials, some even promoted by the SSPX, and just kind of going over those and their points and argumentation style and kind of giving you a little bit more context for understanding why the church permits it, what are some misunderstandings about it, and what we need to know in order to use it or just to understand the use. Anyway, so this article I thought was really good. It's by Thomas Storck from March 2009. I found it on the Pastoral Review, Homiletic and Pastoral Review website, hprweb.com. And I'll put the link below in the description so you can check it out for yourself. There are some footnotes. When I get to them, I will read them if they have something that I think you want to know. Okay, just for fun. Okay. NFP, a defense and an explanation. What are the conditions according to which one may use NFP without offending Almighty God? That's the subtitle. Okay. When is it licit for a married couple to use natural family planning, NFP? What are the conditions according to which we may use this method without offending Almighty God? This will be my subject in this article, both with reference to what the Church's magisterium has said and with some theological reflections on its place in married life. For without doubt, in some circles, NFP has acquired a dubious reputation, a reputation which I consider largely undeserved, and which I hope this article can do something to improve. One section of this article incorporates some material from my earlier article, Marriage and the Use of Natural Family Planning. That's from a different publication. Looks like you can, okay, look that up somewhere. Okay, very often it is said that natural family planning is restricted to hard cases, that for its legitimate use a serious reason is required, but such a judgment is based upon no magisterial text that I am aware of. In fact, the chief texts do not say this at all. Humanae Vitae number 10 does indeed speak of seriis causis with reference to married couples spacing or limiting their children. However, serius in Latin means serious in the sense of opposed to sportive, jocular. See Lewis and Short, page 1679. It does not mean the same as gravis. As we will see elsewhere, Humanae Vitae uses euste with reference to justifying reasons for limiting or spacing offspring. More about that coming, okay? Let us look at these texts, but before doing so, it would be well to consider the place of children with regard to sexuality in marriage. Just as the human race would have no capacity or need for eating unless we needed eating to nourish our bodies, so we would have no capacity for sexual activity if that activity were not oriented toward the procreation of children. Although both eating and sexuality have other goods connected with them, such as legitimate pleasure, fellowship, strengthening of the bonds between spouses, the allaying of concupiscence, nevertheless, neither would exist unless it had the obvious function that it has, providing either for the good of the individual or of the human race. In fact, the obvious connection of sexuality with procreation is one of the best means of demonstrating to modern pagans and secularists that a hedonistic ethic is contrary to human nature itself. Sex is not simply there, it has a built-in purpose. Now, marriage is the context within which both nature and the revealed law of God command that sexual activity take place. Since sexual activity left to itself usually results sooner or later in children, these children clearly need parents to protect and raise them. Marriage in the family exists chiefly to provide the proper context for child raising. Thus, the Church formulated the entirely common sense teaching that the principal end of marriage was children, both their procreation and their education. Finis principalis matrimonii est generatio et educatio prolis. Okay, there's a footnote. A Tancare, Reviewer Synopsis Theologiae Dogmaticae. It would probably be possible to find literally hundreds of places, encyclicals and papal addresses, the 1917 Code of Canon Law, statements of Roman congregations, theology textbooks, catechisms, rodal decisions, where this teaching was repeated. See the compilation Papal Teachings, Matrimony, selected and arranged by the Benedictine monks of Salem. The index gives numerous references. Okay, so yes, this is something that's well upheld by the Church. That's always important, okay? Or the principal end of marriage is the procreation and education of children. That's the translation of the Latin I already read to you. This is not to devalue the other ends of either marriage or sex, but simply to point out the obvious fact that we have the capacity and desire for sex because it is our means for passing on the gift of life. Otherwise, we would not even have such a capacity and desire. Footnote, this is doubtless the meaning of the famous passage in Gaudium et Spes, number 50, which some have argued changed the Church's teaching on the hierarchy of the ends of marriage. The Council's teaching surely meant only that the secondary ends of marriage are not disvalued by pointing out the obvious priority of the primary end. We do not depreciate the role that a shared meal plays in creating good fellowship by noting that the primary purpose of eating is nourishment of the body. Okay. Sorry. Where am I going? Okay. Anyone then who deliberately engages in sexual activity while at the same time blocking in some way the natural consequences of such acts, obviously acts against nature, against the very nature of man. It is not good to extol the naturalness and beauty of sex and at the same time render the sex act unnatural by a use of perverse human technology. In natural family planning, of course, one does not seek to render the sex act artificially sterile or block its natural consequences. Whatever consequences God and our created human nature have placed in the act are retained. To be sure, the intention is to restrict such activity to times when the wife is likely to be infertile. But is there anything wrong with this? And if not, conditions, if any, must be fulfilled for its licit use. I should point out, first of all, that our intention does not constitute the only criterion of morality. Act, motive, and circumstances. Act, motive, and circumstances. These are the three traditional criteria for judging moral acts. If I need $50 for some legitimate purpose, it makes a big difference whether I get a job and earn that money or whether I steal it from someone. The motive may be the same in each case, but the means differ and render the one act morally good and the other evil. The same is true with regard to sexual morality. Although since the middle of the 19th century, several decisions of the Sacred Penitentiary had made it clear that NFP use was not illicit, the first papal statement on it was in Pius XI's magnificent encyclical Casti Connubii, 1930, after a condemnation of anything that may interfere with the conjugal act to prevent conception. The pontiff went on to say, quote, "Nor are those considered as acting against nature who in the married state use their right in the proper manner, although on account of natural reasons, either of time or of certain defects, new life cannot be brought forth. For in matrimony, as well as in the use of matrimonial rights, there are also secondary ends, such as mutual aid, the cultivating of mutual love, and the quieting of concupiscence, which husband and wife are not forbidden to consider, so long as they are subordinated to the primary end, and so long as the intrinsic nature of the act is preserved." And he has a footnote with the exact Latin text, so you can read that from that quote. The medical knowledge for the use of NFP was just beginning to be known at the time Pius XI wrote this encyclical, but within a few years that knowledge had become better understood and had begun to be distilled into popular works and set out as systems for use by married couples, known at the time, of course, as rhythm or calendar rhythm. As a result of this increasing knowledge, Pius XI's successor, Pius XII, specified more clearly what was licit or illicit in the use of NFP. Let us look at two of his addresses on the subject. The first of these is his famous Allocution to Midwives of October 29th, 1951. He just shows you where you can read that. Curiously, this document is sometimes cited by those who seem to want to restrict unduly the licit use of NFP. Yeah, I've seen that. But in fact, in this address, Pius XII hardly even deals with the ordinary use of natural family planning. Rather, he speaks primarily of those who would, quote, embrace the matrimonial state, unquote, and, quote, use continually the faculty proper to such a state, unquote, but at the same time avoid children entirely. And for this he rightly requires a serious reason. Why is this? The pontiff points out the common sense truth that the human race depends on married couples for much of its temporal welfare. The individual and society, he says, the people and the state, the church itself, depend for their existence in the order established by God on fruitful marriages, unquote. Thus, to embrace a state established by God for the procreation and formation of children, and without a sufficient reason to forego altogether having children, is obviously an injustice. That's a really important thing, that in the context of that address, the Pope wasn't talking about like ordinary use of that. He was talking about like extreme selfish use of it, basically. Okay. It is the kind of action that causes children to cry out, "It's not fair." Such couples enjoy all the benefits and pleasures of marriage and deliberately reject the whole purpose for which such benefits and pleasures were instituted. But even so, Pope Pius does not forbid couples that have some important reason for entirely avoiding pregnancy to marry, for he states, quote, "Serious motives, such as those which not rarely arise from medical, eugenic, economic, and social so-called indications may exempt husband and wife from the obligatory positive debt, i.e. debt to society by having children, for a long period or even for the entire period of matrimonial life," unquote. It says, here Pope Pius differs from a recent writer, Father Chad Ripperger, who opines that couples, quote, "should not marry if they cannot assume the essential obligations of marriage, part of which is the preparedness to have children," unquote. Let's see. Immodesty unrecognized the problems with teaching NFP. Also in Homiletic and Pastoral Review, he gives that quotation, says, "But where a sufficiently grave cause obtains, Pius recognizes that the secondary ends of marriage are nonetheless still present and may justify such a union." Important to know. Okay. The Allocution to Midwives sets forth the basic principles that are needed to address moral questions arising from the use of natural family planning, but it does not work these out in detail. Based on Pius's teaching, we can see that the essential moral question of the use of NFP is a question of balance, the balance of its use and the frequency of its use against the seriousness of the reason for that use. To make use of NFP throughout an entire marriage indeed requires serious justifying reason, or to use it for a long period, likewise. But what of other circumstances? About a month after his earlier address, on November 26, 1951, Pius XII spoke to the Association of Large Families. After praising the generosity of husbands and wives, quote, "who for the love of God and trusting in him courageously raise a numerous family," unquote, the pontiff says the following, quote, "The Church, on the other hand, can understand with sympathy and comprehension the real difficulties of matrimonial life in these our days. For this reason, in our last address on conjugal morality, we affirmed the legitimacy and at the same time the limits, truly very wide, of that controlling of births, which, unlike the so-called birth control, is compatible with God's law. It can be hoped that for such a lawful method, a sufficiently certain scientific basis can be found, and recent research seems to confirm this hope," unquote. This second address by Pius XII, though not treating of the specifics of the moral use of NFP, certainly indicates limits truly very wide, he said, that pontiff had a favorable attitude toward the use of natural family planning and did not desire to restrict it to the most narrow of circumstances. Such an attitude continued throughout his reign until the Church entered the turbulent period of the Council and its aftermath. As everyone knows, after the Second Vatican Council, it was widely expected that despite the authoritative teachings of Pius XI and Pius XII, somehow the Church would and could change her teachings on contraception. Footnote. Because of erroneous interpretations of the conciliar decree on religious liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, many had come to believe that Catholic doctrine could be modified to suit the changing ideas of society. See my article, Catholics and Religious Liberty, What Can We Believe? Okay. Where'd I go? Okay. But Pope Paul VI, in an action that was little short of heroic, issued his encyclical Humanae Vitae on July 25th, 1968. Woo! Although, as we will see, Humanae Vitae continues the same approach to natural family planning use as found in the teaching of Pius XII, we are met with an initial difficulty, based, however, on an error. In the pamphlet edition of Humanae Vitae, published by the Daughters of St. Paul, which features the NC News Service translation, the section that deals with illicit use of NFP, section 16 of the encyclical, reads, in part, as follows, quote, "If, then, there are serious motives to space out births which derive from the physical or psychological conditions of husband and wife, or from external conditions, the Church teaches that it is then licit to take into account the natural rhythms immanent in the generative functions," unquote. This text would seem to teach that any licit use of natural family planning is confined to situations in which, quote-unquote, serious motives are present, so that the same conditions apply to use of NFP simply to space out births as to its use, quote, for a long period or even for the entire period of matrimonial life, unquote, as Pius XII had earlier taught. But this is not the case, for in this instance, it is simply a case of a faulty translation. The Latin of the beginning of the above quotation runs, Si igitur iuste ad sint causae generationes subsequentes intervallandi, quae a coniugum corporis vel animi conditionibus. My emphasis. Oh, I don't even see his emphasis, but anyway. Okay, the word erroneously translated as serious is the Latin word iuste. Paul VI thus speaks of just causes or just reasons, and there is no mention of serious at all. Fortunately, more accurate translations followed, so that in the volume of post-Vatican II documents edited by Austin Flannery, iuste is translated as reasonable. But for reasons unknown to me, serious motives, quote-unquote, has acquired a life of its own, and one sees it repeated again and again. Aside by me, I've seen this even said extreme and grave. Like, people even get more, like, into this, like, making it really, really out there. Okay. Paul VI did not specify exactly what he meant by just reasons, and we will look at that more closely now. But here we should simply note that any use of Humanae Vitae to try to show that serious reasons are required for the licit use of NFP is simply based on an error. Let us look at just two more documents of the Magisterium in our survey of church teaching. And first, the Apostolic Exhortation Familiaris Consortio of John Paul II, November 22nd, 1981. In this document, John Paul not only reaffirms the licitness of, quote, recourse to periods of infertility, unquote, but he praises this practice as likely to lead to, quote, dialogue, reciprocal respect, shared responsibility, and self-control, unquote. He continues, quote, in this context, the couple comes to experience how conjugal communion is enriched with those values of tenderness and affection which constitute the inner soul of human sexuality in its physical dimension also. As he frequently did, unquote, as he frequently did, John Paul in this passage attempts to discover the inner meaning and value of things, and not simply to teach about their proper use and morality, essential though these are. And thus he discerned value in the use of NFP, value more than simply for the spacing of pregnancies, which you get by talking to people who have used it. Oh, okay. Finally, let us look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church. In number 2368, we find again the word just used by Paul VI in Humanae Vitae, and we read, quote, for just reasons spouses may wish to space the births of their children, unquote. This sums up what we have seen above in the teaching of Pius XI, Pius XII, Paul VI, and John Paul II, and may be taken as indicating the Church's judgment on this matter. From these documents of the Magisterium, we can see that the Church does not look on natural family planning with a jaundiced eye. To be sure, excusing reasons are necessary for its use, but Pius XII mentions the quote-unquote very wide limits for its licit use. John Paul II speaks of its value in the development of marital love. We have also seen that except for its use over the entire lifetime of a marriage or for a long period, the Magisterium has never required serious or grave reasons for its use. Let us look at the issue more generally and examine the question of what might be just reasons for its use. We should keep in mind what seems to be the basic line of papal thought, namely that the longer the use, generally speaking, the more serious the reason that will be required. Thus, for example, it would seem that for a couple with only 1 or 2 children, to voluntarily cease having children would indeed require some serious and extraordinary cause, or to space children 6 years apart would require a more serious reason than 3 years, and so on. I wish to approach the remainder of this discussion from 2 points of view. The first involves the question of the primary end of marriage, which I mentioned above, namely the procreation and education of children. Now, the important thing to note about this is that the primary end of marriage is the procreation and education of children. If we forget the words "and education," we are apt to see the value of marriage only in how many children a couple can have, and even to reduce a wife's value to that of how many children she bears. But if we consider the phrase as a whole, procreation and education, we will reach a different conclusion. For as Pius XII noted, quote, the work of education exceeds by far in its importance and its consequences that of generation, unquote. That's from the allocution to the members of the Second World Congress of Fertility and Sterility, May 19th, 1956. And surely here education means much more than schooling. Perhaps it could be rendered best as formation, the entire spiritual, moral, intellectual, social, and physical shaping of a child, so that he can serve God in this world and attain eternal life in the next. Certainly, in order to be educated, a child must first be generated and born. But as we see all too evidently around us, not all children who are procreated are educated. And if parents are indeed the first and primary educators of their children, then the state of the parents' health, both physical and psychological, has a great impact on their ability to educate their children. He has a note here, a footnote, that this references Gravissimum Educationis and John Paul II's Familiaris Consortium. Okay. Thus, if parents are stressed or constantly tired or overworked, they are not apt to be the best educators of their children. I am not speaking of their ability to ferry their children around for the latest in art or music lessons or sports camps. Rather, I am thinking of the daily interaction of parents and children and the strength needed by parents for the sometimes arduous task of rearing their children. It does not conduce to forming children psychologically if their parents are frequently irritable or overly critical. Yet, as is obvious, fatigue and stress tend to bring out such negative qualities in human beings. While it is true that the lesson of generous sacrifice is one of the best that parents can give their children, not everyone is capable of heroic virtue. I'm not sure I agree with that. But anyway, I think everything, the points he's making are good. That exact statement, I don't know if I agree with. Okay, everyone knows mothers who bear 8, 10, or 12 children and who manage such large households with little difficulty, but not everyone has the requisite emotional and physical resources to do this, so that what for some might be done without difficulty, for others might require a heroic virtue that the church has generally not insisted on. Okay, he has a footnote. Footnote says, moreover, natural family planning is perhaps not so easy to misuse as some seem to think. Unlike contraceptive use, where especially with the pill, couples can go on unthinkingly, contracepting for years on end, with NFP, each month a couple must rethink their decision to postpone or avoid the possibility of a pregnancy. And thanks to the God-given attraction of the sexes for each other, they have a strong incentive to throw caution to the winds. That's hilarious. Okay. So I believe, my personal note on this, God wills us all to practice heroic virtue at times, for which he gives us particular grace. But we also need to know our limits, and that God is not asking us necessarily for heroic virtue, the exercise of that in every single area to such a degree as other people that he's calling to a little different lifestyle. So it's good to acknowledge that, like, at some point the human person starts breaking down under certain circumstances, and that can really happen with parenting. And certain people, especially in their own formation or what they've been through in life before and what has prepared them for that or has not prepared them, they may not be equipped due to the circumstances of life to handle as many children as another person might, and that's not necessarily something you can just overcome. They may not have the support at the time that they need it to overcome that. So there's so many circumstances. Okay, some have questioned why suddenly in this age Catholic married couples need to make use of NFP when for centuries such knowledge did not even exist. It says, of course, a form of NFP did exist in prior ages, that of spacing births by nursing, a method still recommended and taught today. He says in a footnote, okay. Father Ripperger, for example, in the article cited in Note 6 states, quote, for centuries people have been getting married and leading perfectly Catholic married lives without knowledge of NFP, unquote, page 49. This, of course, is true, but the answer to that is found in the words of Pius XII to the Association of Large Families quoted above, quote, the Church, on the other hand, can understand with sympathy and comprehension the real difficulties of matrimonial life in these our days, unquote. With the absence of extended families, with denatured food, with often stressful commutes, and even the evil, sometimes necessary, of both parents working outside the home, married life has difficulties that were largely unknown in earlier times. Yes, see, for example, Father Dennis Fahey, the Church and Farming. He begins his chapter on modern processed food with a quotation from Dr. Alexis Carrel, "Modern man is delicate." Oh, interesting. So his thing about denatured food, then he has this footnote. Okay, so go check that out if you're interested. All right. I mean, it's true. We have weird things going on in our day that were not an issue centuries ago. And also, society lived on a very different model, generally, a lot more support and generational living and things like that, where our society has lost that to a great extent, and it would take a lot of time and effort to bring that back. It's not just going to return tomorrow. Okay. All right. It seems as if God provided for the knowledge of female fertility at exactly the right time in the history of mankind, at the time when the increasing complexities of modern life would make such knowledge helpful and even in a sense necessary for modern families. Thus, I would argue that the just causes stipulated by Paul VI for the licit use of NFP would include such reasons as stress, both physical and emotional, and considerations of general bodily health, housing conditions, and income. For we must remember that the limits, truly very wide, about which Pius XII spoke were based on his earlier assessment that it is, quote, medical, eugenic, economic, and social, unquote, causes which render NFP use legitimate. Another line of argument I want to pursue involves a discussion of the purpose of procreation in conjunction with God's original command to Adam and Eve, increase and multiply, from Genesis 1:28. One of the chief insights of the Aristotelian/Thomistic philosophic tradition is that every action has an end. Things exist for a purpose. God's command to Adam and Eve was to bring about the peopling of the earth. While certainly the birth of every human being is a good, the duty of married couples to have children is rationally related to the population needs of the world and the church. As Pius XII taught, quote, the individual and society, the people and the state, the church itself, depend for their existence in the order established by God on fruitful marriages, unquote. A very interesting discussion of this question took place in the 1950s and early 1960s by moral theologians entirely orthodox and loyal to the church's magisterium. In particular, let us look at a work written by Jesuit fathers John C. Ford and Gerald Kelly, Volume 2, Marriage Questions of Their Contemporary Moral Theology, published in 1964. Just looking at his. It says, lest anyone think that Fathers Ford and Kelly were part of the phalanx of dissenting moralists, which at that period was just beginning to operate in the open, the authors explicitly state that the church can never approve of contraception. They say, the church is so completely committed to the doctrine that contraception is intrinsically and gravely immoral that no substantial change in this teaching is possible. It is irrevocable. On page 277 of their book. In this period, between approximately 1963 and the appearance of Humanae Vitae in 1968, few would have been so bold as to make such a statement. Father Ford went on to publish an important article co-authored with Germaine Grisey in the June 1978 issue of Theological Studies called Contraception and the Infallibility of the Ordinary Magisterium, arguing for the infallibility of the teaching contained in Humanae Vitae, which came out. Okay. Fathers Ford and Kelly opine that, even with absolutely no excusing cause based on health, economics, etc., no married couple is bound by the law of God to have more children than is necessary for the general conservation and gradual increase of the human race. They state, quote, there may be difficulty in determining the exact limit for various countries, but certainly today in the United States, a family of 4 children would be sufficient to satisfy the duty, unquote. Footnote. Oh, okay. Same source. They're just telling you the same source. Such an approach to the question of use of natural family planning was not limited to these 2 authors. As they state, quote, verbal acceptance of the theory was expressed by a great majority of some 30 moral theologians who discussed it at Notre Dame in June 1952 on the occasion of the annual meeting of the Catholic Theological Society of America, unquote. I am not insisting on 4 children as necessarily the correct number. In Europe, at least, with its falling population and huge influx of Muslims, a higher number would seem to be called for. I only wish to argue that the general approach of these authors and of the preconciliar moralists was correct. Agreement on the exact number of children which fulfills one's duty is less important than acceptance of the principle involved. In no way do I intend to disparage large families or those heroic spouses who do not wish to use periodic abstinence to space their children. My only purpose in writing is to show that the Church, always a loving mother, speaking through her sovereign pontiffs, has indicated a generous attitude toward NFP use, an attitude, as Pius XII stated it, of, quote, sympathy and comprehension, unquote, for the struggles of married couples. These couples should not have burdens put upon them greater than God requires, and to know what the requirements of God's law are, we simply turn to his church, the Catholic Church, the ark of salvation for all mankind. Last footnote. I have said nothing in this article about the teaching of natural family planning and about certain abuses which it is sometimes said may arise in this connection. These may well be true, and where they exist obviously should be corrected, but they should be corrected in the light of the fundamental theological and moral principles which we have seen in the teaching of the Church, and with the aim of making knowledge of NFP available to all who can use it legitimately. That's the end of the article, end of footnotes. About Thomas Storck, who is the author. Mr. Thomas Storck is the author of The Catholic Milieu, 1987, Foundations of a Catholic Political Order, 1998, Christendom in the West, 2000, and numerous articles and reviews on Catholic culture and social teaching. He is a member of the editorial board of the Chesterton Review and holds an MA from St. John's College, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Many of his writings can be found online at www.thomasstorck.org. Anyway. I hope that was helpful for you. It brought up a lot of good points, so I thought it was worth sharing the article in its entirety. And again, let's not be reading into magisterial texts and official church teaching more than is actually there, and qualifying it, as we may think, prudent, because the church is the mother to the universal church. If she doesn't get more specific, it's because she has good reasons not to. And we don't need to judge that. We don't need to confine it within even more space, as I have seen done in traditionalist circles, and we will be talking more about in future videos. So thank you for watching, and I hope this article was edifying to you. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you again soon. God bless you.